I used to think love could fix anything. I didn't have money, power, or connections. I had Emily. That felt like enough. I was 26, sharing a small apartment, working 2 jobs, and dreaming out loud. We'll get there, I always told her. Just give me time. Emily would smile and say, I know, but her eyes often drifted away. Still, I believed her. I trusted her with my fears, my plans, my weak moments. At night, I held her hand and whispered, one day, I'll give you everything. She'd squeeze my fingers and reply, I don't need everything. I just need you. Money was always the shadow in our room. Rent's due again, she'd say, trying to sound casual. I'd answer, I'll pick up extra shifts. She'd nod, quiet, checking her phone. I hated that silence more than any argument. Sophia sometimes joined us for coffee. She was Emily's best friend, calm and observant. She listened while Emily talked. When I spoke, Sophia met my eyes and nodded. Once she said, softly, you're working hard. I laughed it off. Hard doesn't always pay, I joked. She didn't laugh. One evening, Emily said, do you ever worry we're stuck? I replied too fast, no, this is just the beginning. She paused. I just want stability. I felt my chest tighten. I'm building that, I said. For us. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I pretended confidence, but doubt lived in me. I compared myself to men with cars and clean suits. I hated feeling small. Still, pride kept me standing. I won't quit, I told myself. Emily started coming home later. Work ran long, she'd explain. I believed her. I wanted to. When she dressed up more, I teased, trying to impress me? She laughed, a little forced. You're impossible, she said. One night, I asked, are you happy? She answered, of course. The word felt thin. I followed with me? She hesitated, then said, yes. That pause stayed with me long after she fell asleep. Sophia noticed. As Emily talked about new plans and new people, Sophia stayed quiet. When Emily stepped away, Sophia whispered, you okay? I shrugged. Why wouldn't I be? She looked like she wanted to say more, then stopped. I kept pushing forward. I worked, planned, dreamed. Next year will be different, I told Emily. She replied, I hope so. Hope used to sound warm. Now it sounded careful. The distance grew slowly, like a crack in glass. Her words changed, her touch faded. I felt it, even when I denied it. One night, lying awake, I stared at the ceiling and thought, what if love isn't enough? The thought scared me. I turned toward her and whispered, we're okay, right? She didn't answer right away. Then she said, yeah, we're okay. I wanted to believe her. I needed to. But in that quiet, I felt something slipping and I didn't know how to hold it. The next morning, I made cheap coffee and said, one day, this will be a funny story. Emily replied, maybe, already distracted. I asked, did I do something wrong? She shook her head. No, you're trying. That word again, trying. I walked her to the door. I love you, I said. She answered, love you too, softer than before. When the door closed, the room felt empty. I called Mark from work and joked, still broke, still hopeful. He laughed. Hope's free, he said. That night, Emily scrolled through her phone and smiled at something I couldn't see. I asked, what's funny? She said, nothing. I nodded, pretending not to care. Inside, my stomach twisted. I told myself to wait. But as Emily lay beside me, quiet and distant, fear pressed in. I felt the start of an ending before I knew its shape. I closed my eyes and prayed love would stay as silence answered. Emily asked me to meet her at the cafe near the office. I knew the place meant trouble. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting straight, phone face down, smile practiced. I said, hey. She said, sit. I sat. She didn't ask how I was. She said, we need to talk. I nodded. Okay. She took a breath. I'd been thinking. I waited. She said, love isn't enough anymore. The words landed hard. I said, what do you mean? She replied, I'm tired of struggling. I said, I'm trying. She said, I know. I said, then why are we here? She looked away. Because trying doesn't pay bills. I felt heat rise. So this is about money? She said, it's about stability. I said, I'm building that. She said, you've been building for years. A man walked over with confidence I didn't have. Emily stood. This is Daniel, she said. He's a friend. Daniel smiled and offered his hand. Nice to meet you. I didn't shake it. I said, friend? Emily said, please don't start. Daniel said, I can wait. He didn't move. I said, how long? Emily said, it doesn't matter. I said, it matters to me. She sighed. I met him through work. I said, and? She said, and he showed me what life could be. Daniel added, I never meant to cause pain. I laughed once. Funny how that works. People nearby stared. Emily said, lower your voice. I said, now you care? She said, this isn't a scene. I said, you brought him. Daniel said, I'll step outside. Emily said, no. She looked at me. I'm choosing what's right for me. I said, you're choosing comfort. She said, I'm choosing peace. I said, with him. She said, yes. The word broke something in me. I said, so that's it. She said, I'm sorry. I said, don't. She said, I need more than promises. I said, I gave you myself. Daniel put cash on the table. I'll cover this, he said. I stood. Of course you will. Emily said, please don't be cruel. I said, you ended us in public. She said, I didn't plan it. I said, you planned him. I walked outside. My hands shook. Sophia followed. Wait, she said, I didn't know he'd be here. I said, save it. She said, Emily is scared. I said, so am I. She said, you're not nothing. I said, today I am. She reached for my arm. I pulled away. Sophia said, talk to me later. I said, there is no later. She said, I'm sorry. I said, tell her. I turned and kept walking. Behind me, the door closed. The street felt loud and empty. I stood there, watching couples pass, hearing my heart pound. I realized love didn't leave slowly. It left all at once. In one moment, I lost her, my pride, and the man I thought I was. I checked my phone and saw nothing. I typed a message, deleted it, typed again, deleted again. I said out loud, get it together. No one answered. A stranger brushed past and muttered, sorry. I nodded like it mattered. My chest felt hollow. I told myself, stand up straight. I didn't. I leaned against the wall and breathed. I remembered Emily saying, I need stability, and Daniel smiling like a receipt. I whispered, I wasn't enough. The words hurt more than the breakup. I replayed the cafe, her calm voice, his money, my shaking hands. I asked, when did I become this small? Silence replied. I thought of Sophia's eyes and pushed the thought away. I told myself, don't beg. I promised, don't chase. I decided, don't call. Each promise felt thin. Cars passed, laughter passed, time passed, I stayed. I finally admitted I lost today. Admitting it didn't end me, but it stripped me. I stood alone and understood something simple and brutal. Love left, and it took my self-worth with it. I faced the glass, saw my reflection, and asked, who are you now? The answer scared me, but it was clear. I had nothing, and for the first time, I believed it completely as I stood there breathing alone tonight. Rock bottom doesn't crash. It hums. It hums when the landlord says, you've got a week. I said, I understand. He said, it's business. I packed my life into 2 bags. Emily's mug stayed behind. I didn't want it. I told myself, move forward. My voice sounded empty. I moved into a shared room with peeling paint and loud nights. The guy there said, rent's cheap. I nodded. Cheap was all I could afford. At work, I kept my head down. Mark noticed. He always did. He said, you look thinner. I said, I'm fine. He said, you're lying. We worked late. Machines hummed. My thoughts were louder. What kind of man loses everything? I asked myself. Mark said, you're quiet today. I said, thinking. He said, thinking can drown you. I snapped. What do you know? He smiled. Enough. After shifts, we sat on crates. He handed me water. Eat? He asked. I said, later. He said, later becomes never. I shrugged. Doesn't matter. He leaned closer. It matters if you're still breathing. I laughed once. Barely. Nights were worse. The room echoed with other lives. I stared at the ceiling and argued with myself. She chose money. You chose comfort. No, I chose love. Love didn't pay rent. I clenched my jaw. I'm not weak. The silence answered, you are. Sophia showed up once. She knocked soft. I won't stay long, she said. I crossed my arms. Why are you here? She said. To check on you. I said, on Emily's orders? She shook her head. Mine. I didn't believe her. Tell her I'm fine, she said. You don't look fine. I said, then don't look. She tried again. You didn't deserve that. I said, you stood there. She said, I didn't choose for her. I said, you chose silence. She lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. I pointed at the door. So am I. She left without arguing. The room felt colder. Mark noticed my hands shaking. Coffee? He asked. I said, I can't afford it. He slid a cup anyway. Drink. I drank. He said, you're angry. I said, no. He said, yes. I said, at who? He said, at yourself. That hit. One night he asked, what do you want? I said, to stop feeling small. He said, then stop talking like a victim. I stood. You think I asked for this? He stood too. I think you can outwork it. I laughed. Work didn't save me. He said, it can build you. Days blurred. I skipped meals. I counted coins. I told myself, survive. Mark said, survival isn't living. I said, living costs. He said, so does quitting. He challenged everything. It made me angry. It kept me alive. One late shift, he said, I have something. I said, I'm not borrowing. He said, it's not charity. He paused. It's an opportunity. My chest tightened. What kind? He said, the kind that scares you. I said, I'm already scared. He nodded. Good, fear means growth. I looked at my cracked hands. I thought of Emily's calm voice, Daniel's money, Sophia's eyes. I said, what's the catch? Mark said, no excuses. I swallowed. The hum of rock bottom grew louder. I realized it had a sound and I was tired of listening. Mark didn't dress it up. He said, it's long hours. I said, how long? He said, until you hate it. I said, pay? He said, barely at first. I asked, guarantees? He shook his head. None. I looked at my hands and said, when do I start? He smiled once. Tomorrow. The first rule I made was simple, no Emily. I deleted her number. I blocked her socials. I told myself, don't look back. Every night my mind betrayed me. She chose him. Show her what she lost. Then another voice answered, or show yourself what you're worth. I argued with myself until sleep won. Work was brutal. My body ached. My pride hurt worse. Mark barked, faster. I snapped, I'm trying. He replied, trying isn't enough. That phrase again. I wanted to quit. I wanted revenge more. I imagined success just to rub it in her face. Then I pictured her smile and felt sick. I said, focus. I failed early. I missed deadlines. I broke things. Mark said, own it. I said, I messed up. He said, fix it. I stayed late. I learned by doing. My hands shook less. My excuses died first. Sophia surprised me. She texted, heard you're working nonstop. I didn't reply. She sent another. I won't talk about Emily. I answered, why now? She wrote, because you need help. I wanted to refuse. Instead I asked, what kind? She said, practical. We met for coffee. She said, you waste time. I laughed. Thanks. She slid a notebook over. Plan your weeks. I frowned. You stalking me? She said, no, I plan my own. She showed me schedules, savings tips, contacts. No sympathy. No defense of Emily. Just facts. I said, why are you doing this? She said, because you deserve better choices. I said, she chose wrong. Sophia replied, I didn't agree with how she left. That stayed with me. She didn't excuse it. She didn't explain it away. She just said, work smarter. The hours crushed me. I ate standing up. I slept short. Mark said, you're improving. I said, barely. He said, barely is forward. One night I messed up again. I slammed my fist and said, I'm not cut out for this. Mark said, that's quitting talk. I said, I'm tired. He said, so was I. Revenge thoughts returned when I was weakest. Imagine her seeing you win. I shook my head, no. I told myself, win quietly. I chose self-respect over spectacle. It hurt more than losing her because it meant letting go of anger too. Sophia checked in once more. How's it going? I said, hard. She replied, good. I said, good. She said, hard means change. She didn't linger. She didn't pry. It confused me. It helped. Weeks passed. One night Mark handed me a task alone. I asked, you sure? He said, prove it. I worked through fear. I corrected mistakes before he saw them. When I finished, he checked and nodded. That works. 2 words. They mattered. I walked home lighter. I counted my pay. It wasn't much, but it was earned. I bought proper food. I slept deeper. The next day Mark said, "Keep this up." I said, "I will." For the first time, I meant it. I stood outside after my shift and breathed. No applause. No messages. Just progress. Small, real. I smiled without thinking about her. That scared me and thrilled me. I realized something clear and sharp. Growth hurt more than heartbreak, but it healed deeper. And for the first time since the cafe, I felt like I was moving forward on my own terms. Becoming someone new took time. It didn't arrive with noise or applause. It came with routine. Mark said, "Show up early." I did, he said. "Ask better questions." I did. My body changed. My habits changed. My excuses disappeared. One afternoon, Mark said, "You're ready to handle clients." I said, "Me?" He said, "Yes. Don't mess it up." That's how I met Rachel. She looked me in the eye and said, "You're the one handling my account?" I said, "I am." She said, "Good. I value honesty." I replied, "So do I." We talked numbers, timelines, risks. She nodded and said, "You're prepared." That word mattered. Rachel tested me. She said, "What happens if this fails?" I answered, "Then I own it and fix it." She smiled. That's all I needed. When she left, Mark said, "You didn't flinch." I said, "I was terrified." He said, "You hit it well." I slept that night without dread. Emily tried to reach me. A missed call, then 2. A message said, "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen and put it face down. Mark noticed. "Distraction?" he asked. I said, "Old life." He said, "Keep it old." I did. Sophia and I talked more. Not about Emily at first. About work, about boundaries. One night she said, "Do you hate her?" I answered, "I don't trust her." She said, "That's fair." I asked, "Why are you still here?" She said, "Because loyalty doesn't mean silence." I listened. Rachel pushed me. "You underprice yourself," she said. I replied, "I'm careful." She said, "Careful can look like fear." I adjusted. The deal closed. Mark clapped my shoulder. "First win," he said. I smiled small. Sophia admitted something quietly. "I never agreed with how she left you." I said, "You didn't stop her." She said, "I couldn't." I said, "You could have warned me." She said, "I was wrong." Her honesty surprised me. I said, "I don't forgive easily." She said, "I'm not asking." We talked about regret. She said, "People choose comfort when they're scared." I said, "I was scared too." She said, "You stayed." That landed heavier than praise. I said, "Staying hurt," she replied. "Leaving hurts longer." Some nights I almost broke. I stared at my phone and whispered, "Don't go backward." I reminded myself why I started. I reminded myself who I was becoming. Each reminder felt like lifting weight. Slow, painful, necessary. I noticed changes. I spoke clearer. I stood straighter. Mark said, "You're reliable now." I said, "I wasn't before?" He said, "You were distracted." That truth didn't sting anymore. It felt earned. I stopped checking places Emily might be. I stopped waiting for regret. The space she left filled with work, silence, and calm. I didn't rush it. I trusted it. Emily tried again. "I made a mistake," the message read. I didn't reply. I felt nothing sharp, just distance. That scared me more than pain. I told Sophia. She reached out. Sophia said, "And?" I said, "Nothing." She nodded. Growth. Work filled my days. Discipline filled the gaps. Rachel said, "I want you on the next project." I said, "I can do it." She said, "I know." Confidence settled in me, quiet and steady. Sophia and I walked one evening. She said, "You're different." I said, "Better?" She said, "Stronger." I asked, "Do you feel guilty?" She said, "Sometimes." I said, "Me too." We shared silence without fear. I caught myself laughing once. Not forced. Real. I thought of Emily and felt memory, not longing. I said out loud, "I don't miss her." The words didn't hurt. They freed me. I kept walking, knowing I was becoming someone she wouldn't recognize. And someone I could finally respect, without needing approval, applause, or permission from my past anymore. While choosing patience, discipline, and self-trust every single day, for myself alone now, without looking back again. At last, Success didn't announce itself. It showed up quietly like confidence. Mark said, "You're leading this one." I said, "I'm ready." He nodded. "I know." Paychecks grew. Bills stopped scaring me. I moved out of the shared room. When I signed the lease, the agent said, "Congratulations." I said, "Thank you," and meant it. Rachel introduced me to Mr. Harris. She said, "This is the guy I told you about." Mr. Harris studied me and asked, "What do you want?" I answered, "To build things that last." He smiled. "Good answer. We talked risk, patience, and timing." He said, "I invest in people." I said, "Then I'll earn it." He replied, "You already are." Emily heard about me through friends. The message came soft. "I'm proud of you." I stared at it and felt calm. No rush, no anger. I didn't reply. Later she wrote, "Can we talk?" I asked myself, "Do I owe this?" The answer was no. Sophia noticed my quiet. She reached out again. She asked. I said, "Yes." She said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Steady." She smiled. "That's growth." Mr. Harris challenged me. "You underplay your value." I said, "I respect the work." He said, "Respect yourself too." He offered guidance, not rescue. "Decide faster," he said. "Stand by it." I did. Deals closed. My name carried weight. Mark said, "You've changed." I said, "I stopped begging." Emily tried again. "I made mistakes." She wrote, "I see that now." I read it without shaking. I typed, erased, then closed the app. Sophia said, "You don't have to answer." I said, "I know." She didn't push. That mattered. One evening Mr. Harris said, "Join me at the event." I hesitated. He said, "You belong there." At the venue, people shook my hand and asked my opinion. I answered clearly. I felt present. Sophia texted, "You okay?" I replied, "Better than okay." She sent a simple thumbs up. Across the room, I saw Emily. She froze. Her smile faltered. She looked at my suit, my posture, the way people leaned in to hear me. She walked over, slow. "Hi," she said. I said, "Hello." She searched my face. "You look good," I said. "Thanks." Silence stretched. She tried again. "I didn't expect to see you here," I replied. "Life surprises." She nodded. "I heard you're doing well." I said, "I am." She swallowed. "I'm happy for you." I said, "I believe you." She glanced around, uneasy. For the first time, she didn't look certain. Sophia appeared beside me and said, "Ready?" I said, "Yes." Emily noticed her hand near mine and stepped back. "It was good seeing you," Emily said. I answered, "Take care." No drama. No lecture, just distance. As we walked away, Sophia whispered, "You handled that." I said, "I didn't feel anything." She said, "That's the shift." I thought about the cafe, the shame, the cold goodbye. I felt none of it now. Mr. Harris clapped my shoulder. "Well done," he said. I replied, "Thank you for the trust." He said, "You earned it." I looked around and felt grounded. Later, alone, I checked my phone. Emily had sent one last message. I wish I hadn't chosen comfort. I didn't answer. I turned the screen off and breathed. I realized success didn't ask permission from my past. It didn't wait for apologies. It moved forward when I did. I wasn't desperate anymore. I was present. And as I replayed Emily's uncomfortable eyes, I understood the power shift fully. I hadn't won against her. I had won myself back quietly, completely, and without needing her to notice at all anymore. Karma didn't rush, it whispered. I heard pieces of it before I saw the whole. I was leaving a meeting when I caught Sophia's voice in the hallway. She sounded tired. Emily's voice followed, lower, strained. I didn't mean to listen. I stopped anyway. "She checks my phone," Emily said. Sophia replied. "That's not normal. He says it's concern." Sophia said, "It's control." I leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes. Emily continued, "He wants to know where I am, who I talk to." Sophia answered, "That's pressure." Emily whispered, "I feel small." I felt nothing sharp, just clear. Sophia said, "You chose safety." Emily replied, "I chose fear." I walked away before they saw me. I didn't want to be part of it. Later, Sophia texted, "You okay?" I answered, "Yes." She wrote, "She's struggling." I replied, "I won't interfere." She paused, then said, "I understand." Daniel's mask slipped in public. At a client meeting, he cut someone off and said, You don't get it. The room went quiet. Rachel glanced at me. I said nothing. Mr. Harris leaned back and asked, "Is that how you speak to partners?" Daniel forced a smile. "I'm passionate." Mr. Harris said, "So am I about respect." Afterwards, Sophia said, "He's unraveling." I said, "People reveal themselves." She said, "Do you feel anything?" I said, "Clarity." She nodded. "That's maturity." I didn't correct her. I just listened. Emily tried to talk to me at an event. "Can I explain?" She asked. I said, "Not tonight." She said, "I'm not okay." I replied, "I hope you find peace." She looked surprised. "That's it?" I said, "That's it." She stepped back like she expected anger and found calm. Sophia struggled. One night she said, "I'm torn." I asked, "Between what?" She said, "Being her friend and telling the truth." I said, "Tell the truth." She said, "It hurts." I replied, "So does lying." She exhaled. "You've changed." I said, "I learned restraint." Daniel pushed harder. He demanded faster results, bigger risks. At a presentation, he promised numbers he couldn't deliver. Mr. Harris asked, "Can you guarantee that?" Daniel said, "Absolutely." I felt the room stiffen. I said nothing. Weeks later, the guarantee collapsed. Emails flew. Phones rang. At the board meeting, Daniel raised his voice. "You're overreacting," Mr. Harris replied. "You overpromised." Daniel said, "You backed me." Mr. Harris said, "I backed your honesty." Silence followed. Sophia called me after. "He was removed," she said. I asked, "Are you okay?" She said, "I'm relieved." I said, "That's honest." She added, "Emily cried." I answered, "I won't celebrate." She said, "I know." News spread fast. People whispered. I stayed steady. Rachel said, "You handled yourself well." I replied, "I stayed out of it." She smiled. That's leadership. I thought about how badly I once wanted revenge. I felt glad I chose distance. Emily sent a message. I was wrong about him. I didn't reply. Sophia asked, "Do you want to talk to her?" I said, "Not now." She nodded. "I'll respect that." At the next event, Daniel wasn't there. His seat stayed empty. Conversations moved on. I realized karma didn't need my hands. It worked quietly, patiently, without drama. As I watched people forget him, I felt something settle. Not joy, not pity, just understanding. I didn't win because he lost. I won because I didn't become him. And as the room buzzed with new plans, I stood grounded, knowing restraint was my real strength. And silence was my cleanest answer, while karma finished its work without needing me at all, ever again. Emily asked to meet me alone. Her message was simple. "Please." I agreed because I felt calm, not curious. We sat across from each other in a quiet place. She spoke first. "Thank you for coming," I said. "You said it mattered." She nodded. "It does." She stared at her hands. "I owe you an apology." I waited. Silence stretched. She said, "I chose security over faith." I didn't react. She looked up, surprised. "You're not angry?" I said. "I was. I'm not anymore." She swallowed. "I thought money would make me feel safe." I said, "Did it?" She shook her head. "It made me feel small." She kept talking, faster now. "I told myself I was being practical." I said, "You were scared." She said, "Yes." Her voice cracked. "I didn't believe you'd make it." I answered, "I know." That hurt her more than anger would have. She whispered, "I'm sorry." I said, "I hear you." She reached across the table, then stopped. "Can we start over?" I took a breath. "No." The word was soft but firm. She flinched. "Why not?" I said, "Because starting over would mean pretending the past didn't happen." She said, "I've changed." I replied, "So have I?" She cried quietly. "I ruined everything." I said, "You made a choice." She said, "I regret it." I said, "Regret doesn't rewrite trust." She wiped her face. "Do you forgive me?" I paused. "Yes." Her eyes lit up for a second. Then I added, "Forgiveness isn't a reunion." Sophia stood nearby, waiting. She heard enough. When Emily left, Sophia sat down hard. "That was brutal," she said. I asked, "Are you okay?" She shook her head. "I feel torn." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I love her." I said, "And?" She looked at me, "And I love you." The words hung between us. She panicked. "I didn't mean it like that." I said, "You meant it." She covered her face. I feel like I betrayed her. I said, you didn't choose her life. She said, I stayed quiet too long. I replied, you spoke when it mattered. She cried openly now. I was afraid to lose her. I said, fear makes people quiet. She said, I never defended what she did. I said, I noticed. She looked up. I tried to help you without crossing lines. I said, you did. She asked, do you hate her? I said, no. She asked, do you still love her? I said, not the way you mean. She exhaled. I'm relieved. Then she frowned. Is that wrong? I said, honesty isn't wrong. We sat in silence. She whispered, I don't want to be a replacement. I said, you aren't. She said, I don't want to hurt her. I said, you didn't cause her pain. She nodded slowly. I needed to hear that. Emily texted me later. Thank you for listening. I replied, take care. That was all. Sophia saw the message and looked away. I feel guilty, she said. I answered, guilt fades when you stop lying to yourself. She asked quietly, what are we? I said, we're honest. She said, is that enough? I said, it's a start. She smiled through tears. I don't want to rush. I said, neither do I. That night, alone, I replayed Emily's apology. It didn't stir longing, it closed a door. I realized forgiveness isn't about reopening wounds. It's about letting them heal without needing to return. I forgave her because I didn't want to carry bitterness. I didn't take her back because I finally respected myself. Those truths lived together without conflict. As I lay awake, I understood something clear and steady. Closure doesn't always come with reunion. Sometimes it comes with distance, silence, and the strength to say no without hatred. I slept peacefully, knowing I chose myself. Not revenge, not nostalgia, and not fear, and that choice felt right, final, and quietly powerful for the first time in my life. Sophia and I didn't rush into anything. The first time I asked, are we doing this? She said, only if it's calm. I replied, I don't want chaos. She smiled. Good. We started with walks, coffee, honest pauses. No promises. No pressure. People noticed. At work, someone asked, isn't that her friend? I answered, she's my friend. The word felt safe. Sophia said, they'll judge. I said, they always do. She squeezed my hand. We don't owe them explanations. I believed her. I struggled with guilt. One night I said, I don't want to hurt Emily. Sophia replied, she's choosing distance. I said, I still feel it. She said, feelings don't mean mistakes. That helped. She never competed with the past. She respected it. We talked about boundaries. She said, I need honesty. I said, I need patience. She said, I can do that. I asked, what if this gets messy? She answered, then we clean it together. No drama. Just plans. Emily faded quietly. Fewer messages. Less presence. Sophia noticed and said nothing. I appreciated that. Silence became space. Space became peace. One afternoon I doubted myself. I said, what if I'm choosing comfort now? Sophia laughed softly. You're choosing truth. I asked, how do you know? She said, because you don't hide with me. That was true. At dinner I confessed, I'm scared. She asked, of what? I said, losing you. She said, I'm still here. I said, for now. She replied, I never left. The words settled deep. Public judgment lingered. Someone joked, upgrade? I shut it down. She's not an upgrade. Sophia raised an eyebrow. Then what am I? I said, a partner. She smiled. Say that again, I did. We argued once. Small, honest. I said, I need space. She said, okay. She didn't chase. Later she said, thank you for coming back. I realized safety felt like that. I asked her, when did you see me? She thought. When you kept going after the cafe. I said, I was broken. She said, you were trying. I laughed, that word again. She said, it's different now. She was right. I told her about my doubts. Sometimes I think I'm not enough, she replied. I know who you are. I asked, who? She said, a man who learns. That felt better than praise. Emily sent a final message. I hope you're happy. I replied, I wish you peace. Sophia read it and asked, are you okay? I said, yes. I meant it. One night I said, I want to commit. Sophia paused. Say it slowly. I said, I choose you. She asked, despite the past? I answered, because of what it taught me. She nodded, eyes wet. I choose you too. We didn't celebrate loudly. We planned quietly. I realized love didn't have to be loud to be real. It had to be safe. As we walked home, I thought about how she never left, even when she stayed silent. She showed up with truth, not rescue. I finally saw it clearly. She always saw my worth, even when I couldn't. I held her hand and felt steady. I wasn't running from pain anymore. I was choosing forward. And despite the past, I committed fully, calmly. And without fear, trusting what we built together, knowing this love was different, and finally enough for me. We kept it quiet on purpose. Sophia said, I don't want noise. I said, neither do I. We chose a small place, clean and simple. Mark joked, so this is it? I smiled. This is it. Mr. Harris shook my hand and said, you chose well. I replied, I finally learned how. Before the ceremony, Sophia asked, are you calm? I said, I am. She studied my face. No ghosts? I said, none. She nodded. Good. She took my hand and whispered, if anything feels wrong, say it. I said, everything feels right. Mark leaned in and said, you look steady. I answered, I feel steady. He laughed. That's new. Mr. Harris added, that's earned. Those words stayed with me. Sophia looked at me and said, no speeches? I said, just promises. She smiled. Then promise me honesty. I said, always. She said, promise me patience. I said, especially then. She laughed softly. Deal. When it was time, I said, I choose you. She replied, I choose us. No crowd cheered. No music swelled. Silence held us. I preferred it. After, Mark raised a glass. To growth, he said. Mr. Harris added, to restraint. Sophia squeezed my hand. To peace, she said. I echoed, to peace. Someone asked, did you tell Emily? I said, no. Sophia said, we didn't need to. The question passed without weight. I felt no urge to explain. Later, Sophia said, she here. I answered, I know. She asked, does that bother you? I said, no. I surprised myself. It doesn't. Emily heard through others. A mutual friend texted. She knows, I replied, okay. Sophia watched me type and asked, anything else? I said, nothing else. That was true. I thought about the cafe, the shame, the fear. I thought about how rejection once defined me. Now it felt like a chapter title I'd already closed. I said to Sophia, it's strange. She asked, what is? I said, I don't feel victorious. She smiled. Good. I asked, good? She said, peace lasts longer. Mark pulled me aside. Proud of you, he said. I answered, you helped. He shook his head. You chose. Mr. Harris nodded. Choice builds character. Sophia whispered, are you thinking about her? I said, I'm thinking about us. She smiled. That's the answer. I felt light. We left early. No afterparty, just night air and quiet streets. Sophia asked, hungry? I said, for the right things. She laughed. You're learning, I said, from you. She replied, from yourself. At home, she asked, any regrets? I said, no. She waited. I added, only lessons. She nodded. Keep them. I sat down and breathed. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I'd returned something to myself. Dignity, calm, direction. Sophia rested her head on my shoulder and said, we did this without hurting anyone. I replied, that mattered. She said, you're not angry anymore. I said, I'm not empty anymore. I realized closure doesn't always come with confrontation. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wearing peace instead of triumph. I wasn't defined by rejection now. I was defined by choice. As the night settled, I felt no need to look back. I didn't want her to see me. I didn't need her to regret. I had what mattered. I had chosen forward. And for the first time, the silence felt kind, complete, and enough for me to finally rest, knowing this life was mine and I was home. I went back to the old street alone. Sophia asked, do you want company? I said, I need this. She nodded. I'll be here. The sidewalk hadn't changed. I stood where the cafe used to buzz. I said out loud, you survived. No one answered. That was fine. I walked past the building where I once packed my bags. A neighbor recognized me. You moved back? I said, Just visiting, he said. Things worked out? I replied, they did. He smiled. Good. I sat on the bench where I used to wait for texts. I remembered saying, I'm trying, like it was a shield. I laughed quietly. Trying isn't a plan, I told myself. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt honest. Emily appeared by chance. She hesitated, then approached. Hi, she said. I said, hello. We stood apart. She looked thinner, calmer. You look well, she said. I replied, I am. She nodded. I heard you got married. I said, yes. She paused. Congratulations, I said. Thank you. She glanced at the bench. We used to sit there, I said. I remember. She asked, are you angry? I answered, no. She looked relieved. I'm glad. I said, so am I. Silence settled. She said, I was scared back then. I replied, I know. She asked, do you hate me? I said, no. She swallowed. I hate who I was, I said. People change? She nodded. I hope so. I said, I do too. She took a step back. I won't keep you, I said. Take care. She answered, you too. We didn't hug. We didn't reopen anything. We closed it gently. I walked on and felt light. I spoke to myself. You were insecure. I answered, you learned. I said, you begged. I replied, you grew. There was no cruelty in it. Just truth. I passed my old workplace. Mark had once said, stand up straight. I did now without thinking. I checked my phone. Sophia texted, how is it? I replied, clear. She wrote, proud of you. I smiled. At the park, a man argued on the phone. I remember being that tense. I said quietly, breathe. He didn't hear me. I heard myself. I called Sophia. I saw her, I said. She asked, how do you feel? I answered, at peace. She said, come home. I said, on my way. I stopped at the bench one last time and spoke softly. You were afraid of being nothing. I answered myself, you were becoming something. The past didn't argue. It rested. As I walked away, I accepted the man I used to be. Not with pride. Not with regret. With understanding. He did what he could with what he knew. I knew more now. I didn't need to rewrite history. I didn't need apologies anymore. I needed presence. I had it. When I reached home, Sophia opened the door and asked, ready for dinner? I said, yes. She smiled. You're quiet. I replied, I made peace. She kissed my cheek. Good. That night, I slept easily. I wasn't chasing approval. I wasn't proving anything. I had faced my past without flinching. Acceptance didn't feel loud. It felt steady. I understood that growth wasn't about erasing who I was. It was about carrying him forward with kindness, clarity, and restraint. I turned off the light and rested, knowing the man I used to be no longer controlled me, and the man I became was enough, complete, and finally free to live without looking back again. I woke up before sunrise and sat quietly. Sophia stirred and asked, you okay? I said, I'm thinking. She smiled. Good thoughts? I said, honest ones. She rested her head back down and said, tell me later. I promised I would. At breakfast she asked, do you miss the chase? I laughed. I don't miss desperation. She said, neither do I. We ate slowly, no rush. No hunger for more than we had. At work, Mr. Harris said, you've built something solid. I replied, I built myself first. He nodded. That's why it lasts. Mark clapped my shoulder. You remember the crates? I said, every day. He said, good, don't forget. I won't. People still talk. Someone said, you won in the end. I answered, I didn't win against anyone. They frowned. I added, I stopped losing myself. That ended the conversation. Sophia asked me that night, do you ever feel guilty for being okay? I said, I used to. She asked, and now? I said, now I feel grateful. She smiled. For what? I said, for pain that taught me, for silence that shaped me, for love that stayed honest. I thought about money. I have it now. It pays bills. It buys comfort. It doesn't buy peace. Peace came when I stopped proving and started choosing. I said to Sophia, wealth didn't save me. She replied, self-respect did. I kissed her hand. Exactly. Emily crossed my mind once. Not with anger, not with longing. With acceptance. I hoped she found her way. I didn't need to see it. Karma had already spoken quietly and fairly. Sophia asked, "Do you feel justice?" I said, "I feel balance." She said, "Is that better?" I said, "It's calmer." She nodded. Calm lasts. I stood in front of the mirror and said, "You're enough." The words didn't echo. They settled. I remembered the man who begged to be chosen. I didn't mock him. I thanked him for surviving long enough to change. At dinner, Sophia raised a glass and said, "To us." I added, "To becoming." She laughed. "Always growing," I agreed. "Always choosing." I realized something simple. I had nothing when I needed approval. I had myself when I stopped asking for it. That shift changed everything. Love grew safer. Work grew cleaner. Sleep grew deeper. I wrote one last message in my notes and deleted it. I didn't need to say it to anyone else. I said it to myself instead. You are not what you lost. You are what you kept. Sophia asked, "Ready for tomorrow?" I said, "I am." She asked, "Why?" I answered, "Because I trust myself." She leaned in and said, "That's attractive." I laughed. "That's earned." As night settled, I felt no hunger for revenge, no need for validation, no urge to look back. Justice had come without noise. Karma had worked without my hands. Transformation had happened without applause. I lay down and closed my eyes. I felt full without excess, strong without hardness, loved without fear. I understood the truth at last. I had nothing when I measured myself by others. I had everything when I stood on my own. And in that quiet certainty, I found the ending I didn't know I was searching for. Not victory, not revenge. Just self-respect, steady love, and the calm knowledge that I became the man I needed when I lost everything else. And that man was finally enough, complete, grounded, and free to live forward without regret, fear, or the weight of the past ever again.